This is the moment you've been waiting for, adventurer. The frozen halls of the north are opening up and the Lich King himself is ready for an epic duel to the death. Icecrown Citadel promises awe-inspiring loot like Deathbringer's Will and the mighty Oathbinder. We also can't forget the epic lore and the legendary cutscene that changes the course of Azeroth forever. But there's one weapon that stands above the rest with its awe-inspiring power and prestige. Of course, we're talking about Frostmourne, the fearsome rune-inscribed two-handed longsword with the power to shatter and imprison the souls of its victims. Unfortunately, just like Gandalf didn't trust the Eagles to drop the ring in Mount Doom, Tyrion didn't trust mortals to wield Frostmourne. So we're left with just Shadowmourne instead, which is still the best legendary in Wrath of the Lich King, and a weapon that every warrior, paladin, and death knight will be battling for. The mystery of which class should actually get Shadowmourne first is a question for my Shadowmourne prior video. It's available up in the top right. As for how to actually get the legendary axe though, that's what we're discussing today. Fellow adventurers, Blizzard has dropped some huge news that changes every aspect of the Shadowmourne questline. Let's talk about all the big changes and how to get your Shadowmourne as quickly as possible. But first, an extremely brief recap of how the questline used to work. Originally, you as a Death Knight, a Warrior, or a Paladin would have to first obtain friendly reputation with the Ashen Verdict. Then you could pick up an intro quest from Darien Mograine right inside the entrance of ICC. The second step was to gather 25 Primordial Serenites, which are kind of like the new Runed Orb of the phase. You also had to go out and get the Light's Vengeance Mace from Dragonblight. Part of this step was also obtaining the blood of Rotface and Festergut, and each boss would only drop one per week. Your reward for all that would be the Shadow's Edge Axe, a surprisingly good 264 item level axe that's really helpful in raid progression. Then you'd be sent back into ICC to infuse Shadow's Edge by completing various quests. The first quest, A Feast of Souls, required you to kill 50 trash mobs in the raid. Then comes the 3 separate infusions involving different raid mechanics. The first is the Unholy Infusion. That requires you to become an abomination during the Putricide fight and then absorb slimes. Once you reached 100 energy in your abomination, you could then use the Shadow Infusion ability on your vehicle. This gives you a 6-minute buff that has to be on when Putricide dies. The second infusion is to get hit by Blood Mirror on the Lanathel fight and then bite 3 people. The third infusion is Frost, and you have to tank 4 of Cinderghost's Frost Breath attacks. You could either stack Frost Resist gear or just time cooldowns like Divine Sacrifice. Either way, I definitely recommend doing all of these on normal mode. Once you're finished infusing, you finally unlock the privilege of looting Shadowfrost Shards, which you need 50 total of to complete the Shadowmourne questline. Then once you have the 50 shards, you'll just get the Shadowmourne, but there are also bonus quests once you defeat the Lich King too. You'll even get access to the sealed chest with even more envy-inducing rewards like the Tabard of the Light. Back to the Shadowfrost Shards though, Shadowfrost Shards originally had a 25 to 50% drop rate from normal mode bosses. Then on heroic mode, they had between a 51 to 99% drop rate. If you were part of a normal mode guild, this meant you would be able to complete a Shadowmourne in anywhere from 12 to 15 weeks. In a heroic mode blasting guild though, that number could be closer to 7 or 8 weeks. The questline. On paper, the questline works really well. First, you pick somebody in your guild to do the Shadowmourne questline. The first week, you funnel 25 Primordial Serenite to your chosen player from all your different raid alts. Then you work with your chosen star to complete each step of the questline to ensure Shadowfrost Shards are unlocked as quickly as possible. The idea before was that you complete the entire questline primarily in normal mode. Then you'd arrive at the Lich King just in time to loot exactly 1 Shadowfrost Shard. Moving into week 2, you could get to farming and progressing heroic modes and acquiring the maximum shards per boss. The Tradeoff. The problem here is that you just sacrificed any potential chance at speedrunning in the first week. You'd also be losing a huge amount of heroic gear. Instead of progressing on heroic for easier bosses like Rotface and Festergut, you'd be worrying about your Shadowmourne player getting his quest done in time. Instead of racing through the raid and going for a server first achievement, you'd be prioritizing cooldown stacking to keep your warrior alive while he tanks Cinderghost's Frost Breath. We haven't even mentioned the part where your guild would be sacrificing 264 crafted upgrades to funnel Primordial Serenite to a single player. Which of course means that when you finally do have enough Serenite to use for crafted gear, it'll already be outdated compared to tier pieces. And after all this, the only reward from an entire week of planning around the questline is a single Shadowfrost Shard. I even remember being on the Scotty J podcast a few months ago when we talked about all the potential changes with this questline. If you want to get access to deep discussions about the future of the game earlier than everybody else, make sure to subscribe to the channel. So something had to change. Sure enough, change did arrive this week, and it affects every aspect of the Shadowmourne questline. The first change is that the drop rate of Shadowfrost Shards is now the same on both heroic and normal modes. This makes a lot of sense because ICC is extremely difficult. For most guilds, normal mode will be the norm for several weeks for most bosses. In old interviews, Blizzard also mentioned a 251 minimum recommended item level for Heroic. It really doesn't make much sense to create a salt mine for Shadowmourne questers when their guild keeps failing at Heroic modes the first month. The second change is that there'll now be 5 guaranteed Shadowfrost Shards per week. These will drop from Sourfang, Lanathel, Putricide, Cindergosa, and the Lich King on both normal and heroic modes. This means that Shadowmourne can't really take more than 10 weeks if you fully clear every week on normal mode. The third big change is that Primordial Serenite will now be available from a new source. Primordial Serenite, to recap, is the new Runedorb equivalent that could only be obtained from raid bosses or from 23 Emblems of Frost. The main purpose of Primordial Serenite is to buy and craft new 264 legs and boots, but you also needed 25 Primordial Serenite for a Shadowmourne Week 1. That means prices were guaranteed to be sky high, even over 10,000 gold each. In fact, the prices were going to be so high that Blizzard had to step in. They're now making Serenite buyable just from running Titan Rune dungeons. Alongside the new Titan Rune Gamma dungeons will also be a new vendor called the Defiler Scourgestone vendor. Currently, every boss in Titan Rune Gamma dungeons drops 1 Defiler Scourgestone. That is very different than the one from the final boss from Sidereal Essence from old dungeons. Now, both the drop rate and the pricing are subject to change, but currently for 12 Defiler Scourgestones, you can buy 1 Primordial Serenite. That means the price of Serenite in general will be much lower than expected, maybe even under 3,000 gold each week 1. This does make Shadowmourne much cheaper to craft. My initial estimates were that the Serenite alone would cost over 200,000 gold. The real reasoning Blizzard gave, though, is that they wanted people to be able to craft gear early on. The problem was demand for the Shadowmourne questline was gonna price people out. Then by the time they could afford to craft the gear would be completely obsolete and the whole system would be pointless. The fourth and perhaps biggest change, though, is that you can now obtain Shadowfrost Shards without being on the Splintered Throne portion of the questline. This completely changes how you would approach Week 1, since you no longer have to make the questline your sole focus during launch week. Instead, you could focus on progression or speedrunning like normal, and your Shadowmourne star will still get his shards anyways. So now that we know the changes, let's get to the new optimal way to obtain Shadowmourne. The first step, of course, is to start the questline. At this point, you should prioritize completing the raid with your guild. Whether it's normal or heroic really doesn't matter. This is also an excellent time to point out that you can completely pug a Shadowmourne on normal modes now. Just reserve the shards for yourself, and within 2 months, you're all but guaranteed to have a legendary. Back to the questline. Make sure in the first week to loot both the bloods from Rotface and Festergut. In between your raid, you should also prioritize world tours on all your alts to maximize Defiler Scourgestones to buy Primordial Serenite. Don't forget to also be farming Emblems of Frost in all your alts. That includes the 10-man lockouts, the 25-man lockouts, everything to maximize Primordials. Personally, I plan to sell my Primordials to pay for my Shadowmourne. There's really no huge rush to stockpile them early unless you really want a Shadow's Edge. Once you have a couple stacks of Shadowfrost Shards, though, you should definitely work on finishing those Primordials. When you do get the 25, it's time for the 3 infusion quests. Now all that's left to do is finish collecting your shards and wield your Shadowmourne to dominate the meters. Speaking of topping the meters, though, you need to check out my Phase 4 DPS tier list. It'll show you exactly who's going to perform best with those big Shadowmournes.